Folks, we are currently experiencing inflation in the automotive world. Except, I'm not just talking about the price. I'm talking about horsepower too, and acceleration. So, I was just on 0 to 60times.com, and I went ahead and calculated the average 0 to 60 time of every brand that's out there, and then came up with the average 0 to 60 time of every car from the decade of 2020 in general. Just as a caveat, this may not be very accurate just because this site tends to favor performance oriented cars, and it may not have every version of every car available. So this isn't the most accurate. But with that being said, it came out to 5.1 seconds. 5.1 seconds is the average 0 to 60 time of every car, well, virtually every car since the 2020s. If you look at the car, this wasn't got awfully close to my car. If you look at the car and driver quickest cars of the 80s, every single one of them, except for the number one car, had a 0 to 60 time between 5 and 4.5 seconds. The number one was, of course, the Porsche 959, which was 0 to 60 in 3.6 seconds. So it's almost a full second ahead of the next fastest car, or the next quickest car, rather, which was the Corvette Z01, which did 4.5 seconds. So, you mean to tell me the quickest car of the 80s, so that's like a 1989 version. So basically the quickest car of 1990 does 0 to 60 that's barely faster than the average car of today. Like, we've lost perspective. You tell a lot of folks nowadays that this car does 0 to 60 in 5.1 seconds, or my car does 0 to 60 in 5.1 seconds. A lot of them will say that's slow, or that's not that fast. But I mean, 4.5 seconds for a Corvette ZR1, a C4 ZR1. Like, back then, nobody was complaining about the car not having enough power. No one was complaining that this car is slow, it's not fast enough. And yet, we're doing that today. Like, 5 seconds, 0 to 60, that didn't get any slower as time went on. 5 seconds is still 5 seconds, and that's still quick. And my car, I timed the 0 to 60 of 5.3 seconds. And everyone that was in this car, that I let drive the car, they all agreed that this car is, like, very quick, and it doesn't need to be any quicker than it actually is. Like, there just comes a certain point where, I guess it depends on where you live too, but like, most of the time, like, these sub 5 seconds, sub 4 seconds, it's unnecessary. Like, there comes a certain threshold where, like, okay, this is plenty fast. Like, any faster than this is just, like, for bragging rights, or just for out of ridiculousness, or maybe it's for ego. You know, I recently saw a post on Instagram. I forget which model what it was, but it was a 5-cylinder Volvo that was tuned and making like 500 something horsepower, and it beat a Lamborghini Gallardo in a drag race. The people were saying, like, oh, that's not a big deal, a Gallardo is slow. Are you kidding me? Like, you gotta be kidding me. Like, if you've driven a Gallardo, or you've been in one, you can't in good faith tell me that it's slow. Otherwise, like, you're trolling. You drive a Gallardo and you come away from that experience saying this car is underpowered, or this car is slow, or this car is not that fast, unless you're used to just driving cars that are that fast, unless you're used to driving like 1,000 horsepower supers every day, which the internet is full of that. And I think that's part of the problem too. In the online world full of 1,000 horsepower supers, skylines, GTRs, whatever, it really made us lose perspective. Like, cars that are fast, cars that are objectively quick are no longer objectively quick unless they beat that benchmark, which is, I mean, God knows what that benchmark is. For all we know, tomorrow people can be saying, oh, we're only beating 1,000 horsepower super. That's slow anyway. Like, who knows? Because frankly, I'm surprised that people think that 7 seconds 0 to 60 is slow. Personally, for me, like, that's quick enough. And like 6 seconds is plenty quick. But again, that could just be me though. But it really is true. Like, horsepower has just been steadily inflated. Like, if you were to tell folks back then that you can buy a Ford Fusion or like a Ford, oh, there was a Fusion that just passed by. That you can buy a Ford family sedan, like a Fusion Sport that has like 340 horsepower, they wouldn't believe you. There will be a Ford out there that has the same power level as like a Ferrari, like almost the same power level as like a Ferrari Testarossa. Speaking of Ferraris, like, if you guys seen the new Prius, I know I mentioned this several times, but if you guys seen the new 2023 Prius, it's way quicker than the one that came before that. The one that came before that, 0 to 60 was like 9.5 seconds or so, maybe 10 seconds. Now the 0 to 60 in the slowest one, the slowest Prius, mind you, does 0 to 60 in 7.3 seconds. And the quickest one does 0 to 60 in 6.5 seconds. You know, this does 0 to 60 in 6.5 seconds? A Ferrari 308 GTS. Or at least it's in the 6 second rate. Like, for a Prius to be as fast as, okay, I know it's an old Ferrari, but still, like, again, you don't drive a Ferrari 308 GTS and come away from it thinking this is slow unless you've been spoiled by other cars. Aside from that, there's no shot that you genuinely think that that's slow. Like, in a lot of ways, car enthusiasts are spoiled these days. Like, the fact that, like, you can buy a 300 horsepower car for not that much, for less than that price of an average new car. The fact that something like a Mustang GT is like a $40,000 car, which, by the way, a Mustang GT nowadays, that would decimate a Ferrari Testarossa in a drag race. A Lamborghini Countach has no chance. A C4 Corvette ZR1 has no chance. A 959 would probably barely beat it in a drag race. We're so spoiled these days. Like, cars are just so fast that it's ridiculous. I see little reason for us to complain anymore. I somewhat see little reason for us to modify cars that came out in the last decade to be even quicker than they actually are. Because frankly, they're already so quick that, like, we'll approach speeds that can land us in jail in no time. I think electric cars definitely contributed to that as well, a lot. Like, you can get a quick EV for not that much money. Even like this quote unquote slow EVs are still fairly quick by today's standards. But I think the EV part is interesting because, you know, these car enthusiasts, they say something peculiar when people commend electric cars for being very quick. They say that, you know, it's not about the acceleration, it's about the experience. You come to find out these are the same people that would complain about like a Civic Type R being too slow because it does 0 to 60 in like 5.1 seconds. It's like, oh, there's cars out there that are faster than that. Or that these are the same people that complain about cars that do 0 to 60 in like 4 seconds. Or, oh, don't even get me started on the 6 second cars. They go in on that. So it's like, do you really care about the experience, or do you just not like EVs and you just want to find a way to discredit them? That's why I find it funny that it takes a car being electric for them to say that, okay, maybe it's not about the acceleration, maybe it's about the experience. But then when they do find a car that finally does beat it in acceleration, then it is about the acceleration all over again. And oh, look at that! See, electric cars are not that good after all. We just beat it with this M3, even though we spent tens of thousands of dollars modifying it to make it over 1,000 horsepower. But hey, a win is a win, am I right? Then acceleration matters. Then acceleration times matter. Then quarter mile times matter. Then 0 to 60 matters. Yeah, it's a lot of hypocrisy. But you know, the crazy thing is I actually agree. I agree that it's not about the numbers. It's about the experience. It's about the pleasure that the car gives you. And we shouldn't get so caught up in these numbers. And yet the same people that say that are the same people they contributed that quarter mile and that 0 to 60 craze. And you know, I understand too. I understand like when a car is actually slow compared to its competitors. I understand that 11 or 12 seconds 0 to 60 is not acceptable when it comes to certain cars. Like, I understand that a supercar needs to be faster than a Testarossa from 30 years ago, but at the same time, you have to compare the acceleration within the cars that it competes with. You have to appropriately compare it as well. Like something like a Hyundai Veloster N that does 0 to 60 in 5 seconds flat, or maybe even 4.8 seconds. Of course, that there's going to be cars quicker than that, but in the grand scheme of things, like when you account for every type of car possible, including supercars, hypercars, all that other stuff, of course, in the grand scheme of things, it's slower compared to those. But what about the car that it competes against? Or what about the cars that? What about like the average car, like the average? Because when I say the average car does 0 to 60 in 5.1 seconds, again, that's based off of every car that's, well, not even every single car, but every car that was listed on that website. A lot of which are performance cars, some of which are supercars, hypercars. That's taking into account everything. But if you take like the normal brands and stuff like that, or like the normal cars or the, you know, quote unquote regular traffic, if it's faster than that by a good margin, then there's still something to be said for that. So how do you measure? Okay, so what would be appropriate for saying which car is fast and which one isn't? You have to drive several cars. And from different categories too. Like, you can't just drive a bunch of sports cars or a bunch of supercars and then come away from that and then go into certain, like, quote-unquote regular traffic and then say this car is slow, even though it can be way quicker compared to its competitors. But I think most people don't do that. They stay within one bubble, and anything that's outside that bubble, they don't know how to compare it just on its own merits. They have to compare it and hold it to ridiculous standards. It's the same thing with lap times too. I see a lot of people bring up lap times, and oftentimes they don't appropriately compare the times to similar cars. They create false equivalencies and then just run with that. It's hard to even say. Some people are just ridiculous, and they just have ridiculous standards and expectations. Ridiculous and unrealistic. And just because a car has a fast 0 to 60 or quarter mile time, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to have a fast lap time. Like, there's so much that goes into that. Weight, suspension, geometry, tires, brakes, weather conditions, track conditions, to say nothing about the driver as well. Aerodynamics, downforce, lift, some stuff that I can't even think of right now, but there's so much that goes into it. But people take an incredibly, just like everything else, they take an incredibly complex matter, subject. They reduce it to some overly simplified thing, such as like the lap time, just by the number, just by the face of it, and then you just run with that. There's a lot more stuff that goes into it that people just somehow look past. It's ridiculous. So cars are getting a lot faster these days. Frankly, I think we can chill. I think we can calm down with speed. I can see why the Japanese in the mid-90s, they had the gentleman's agreement, which of course they just underrated the cars anyway. But I can see why, because now cars are just getting insane. Like, you don't even have to get to like the mid-tier, like even like some of the lower to mid-tier performance cars, just by going wide open throttle for like more than 5-6 seconds, you're at crazy speeds, dangerous speeds. And it's just so unnecessary. Like, people were flying, losing control and just flying off the road and landing the cars into people's houses because they're just that fast. And, as much as as cool as it is that cars are getting faster and, like, we can get cheap speed these days, and as fun as it is to experience that speed for yourself, we just had to calm down at this point. And it's these fools that keep saying that these fast cars are slow, like, they're contributing to that. Like, if you truly believe that it's not about the 0 to 60, it's not about the numbers, it's about the experience, and yet you drive a car that does 0 to 60 in 4 seconds, 3.5, sometimes below 3 seconds, and you think you don't acknowledge that that's ridiculous speed, you think that's just merely adequate speed, then you're part of the problem. But I guess don't believe everyone that claims that they value experience over the speed, because not everyone means it. I mean it. But anyways, I think that's about it for me. I pretty much went over everything that I wanted to go over, but let me know in the comment section what you guys think.